Okay, my dear friends, good evening. Thank you very much for coming for our continuous educational session. I truly appreciate that. We're conducting our meetings on Sundays at a variety of different times, talking about a variety of different Christian topics, dealing with biblical studies, church history, holy sites. And tonight I would like to talk to you about the holy sites of Asia Minor. It's impossible to cover everything. I'll share with you some of my personal impressions, some of my personal knowledge. I'm not claiming to be necessarily a church history expert, but I wanted to share with you some things that may be of importance to you as Christians who are aware of their own Christian legacy, and that lies in seemingly a very unusual place, especially if we'll take into consideration modern political discourse, the country of Turkey. I'll not going to avoid using the word Turkey, but for the all sakes, the use of word Asia Minor would be perhaps more appropriate, for the simple reason that historical period that we're dealing with is indeed covers the time span before the arriving of the Turkish tribes, and to the great extent even before the arrival of the armies of Islam. Turkey is located in the Eastern Mediterranean, northeastern Mediterranean, covers a huge span of territory all the way from Aegean Sea in the west to the Caucasian mountains in the east. A tremendous span of land, very large country, especially, in comparison to any European destination, with varied climate. Terrain is incredibly beautiful. Incredibly beautiful. It has mountains, it has lakes, it has rivers, it has forests, it has saline deserts, it has all that you could imagine. Traveling through the country presents incredible aesthetical pleasure, and this land actually was inhabited for a very, very long time. Over here you see the geographical map of Asia Minor, or the country of Turkey of today. But if we look back in the history of mankind and what in discourse is still called the beginning of Western civilization, although it was hardly Western in a sense as we understand Western of today, as mainly Anglo-Saxon and Germanic, we could say that what our cultural legacy is, what our cultural roots is, it's in the Fertile Crescent. It's the beginning of human civilization as we know it, at least in the western part of the world, in comparison to, say, far countries like China or India. And over here you can see on the map to your left-hand side, to your right-hand side, colored in this pinkish color and colored in green, so-called Fertile Crescent. This is the beginning of the earliest presence of civilized, as we would understand it in terms of today, mankind, right? First countries appeared in Mesopotamia, but even before any countries, we already see the settlements in the southeastern Turkey and what's today Mesopotamia, and where the Christian Bible and Jewish Torah places paradise. It's very interesting. When I was teaching at the seminary at St. Tikhon's Biblical Archaeology, we did discuss with my students as to how interesting it is that perhaps a biblical myth, and by myth I don't mean fairy tale, God forbid, but an attempt to relate historical experience of sorts into the written form, into the sacred history, actually very justly point out of where civilization as we know it have started. And in more recent years, of course, in recent decades, on the territory of Asia Minor, several very important monuments, several very important places have been found. For instance, you probably all heard that Jericho is oldest continually inhabited city, and there were some finds discovered that confirmed that statement, but we never see the actuality of this ancient city. And here in front of you, there is a place called Chateau Hayouk that from the Turkish transfers as Fork Tumulus, which was a very large, of course, at the time, Neolithic settlement that goes back millennia before any kind of organized state. Over here, as you see in the upper photograph, actual excavations. In the lower right, you see the artistic rendition of how the settlement may have looked like. It is city even without any kind of fortification. It's before any kind of human organization, as we know it, was not possible. Obviously, it is possible as we see it in front of us, but was done. And there was no any kind of organized hierarchy. There was no kind of organized cult. There was nothing that was organized. But we already see the development of a village at the time when most of the people were still hunters and gatherers. Another very interesting find that was even more recent and was absolutely turned our understanding of appearance of religion from the academic standpoint of view, of course, was finding of this incredible sanctuary. Some of you may say that it looks somewhat like Stonehenge in England, but it certainly predates it. And again, what's amazing about that place called Göbekli Tepe in Turkish, or Podbelly Hill, was discovered really by accident that in this southeastern corner of Turkey, this temple, religious structure, was discovered, and it was very apparently based on the archaeological evidence built by the people who shouldn't have had any sanctuaries. It took a tremendous group effort to move massive stones and to organize that place of worship. It throws out of the way whole understanding of how religion came about. The general academic description is you have permanent settlements, you have teamwork, you have access to food. Of course, I'm vulgarizing a little bit by trying to put in very plain terms. You have access to food. With access to food, you have generated wealth. With wealth, you have ascent of hierarchy, and with presence of hierarchy, you have development of a religious cult. Over here, people who built it didn't have any organized living. What's curious is that around this area, the people were living who were first domesticating crops and domesticating animals. If we'll take liberty and we'll think about the curse slash blessing that is given by God to Adam and Eve, what does it say after they expelled from paradise, from the land of plenty, from the land of joyful living? Is that in the sweat of your eye, you're going to toil the field and it's not going to produce to you all that much. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but nevertheless, you know the allusion to, you see the allusions that I'm making to the first chapters of book of Genesis. And over here, we see indeed this Paradisic Temple. When this temple was found, it turned all impression, imagination of the history of the people that was happening at the time, and it truly was named as Paradise Found. Whatever little we know about the book of Genesis, wherever we could read outside, of course, literally approach to it, which some Christians certainly have, but if we'll try to reconcile the knowledge that we have today with what we're finding there, this is the paradise. This is the origin of the in our little knowledge that we have, the place where gods were worshipped before people were even settled in the villages and in the cities. But we're talking about very ancient history. Because land was fertile, we have a lot of contesting nations coming and many different kingdoms being established. Perhaps the most significant were the Hittites, and Hittites may be important or interesting to us for the simple reason that we hear about them in the Bible, and we hear about their conflicts with ancient Egyptian kingdom, you know, famous Battle of Kadesh, and they have some biblical prominence. But glossing over and not dwelling too much on the maps, fast forward to the first millennia BC, we have a very huge span of Achaemenid Empire, according to the Greek historian Herodotus. And that's, commonly speaking, Persia and the territories that were dominated by the Persian Empire. And those were the same Persians who had conflict with ancient Greece, thinking of Alexander of Macedon. Maybe you read history, maybe you saw movies, but this, the 300 Spartans and all good things, this is the time span that we're talking about, Persia versus ancient Greece. And then Persia is defeated by Alexander of Macedon. So we see the same geographical span, in particular Asia Minor. And why I'm mentioning it to you is because, of course, Christian antiquity was to a large degree Hellenized. The territories conquered by Alexander of Macedon were considered to be barbaric, and they needed to be brought up to speed with culture. And that's where Hellenization of those territories, to a various degree, have begun. Of course, in places as far-reach as Afghanistan and Pakistan, Hellenism didn't hold for too long, but even it still had left a visible and discovered marks. But Asia Minor, Egypt, Middle East or Upper East, if we'll use a little bit antiquated language, they definitely were very heavily Hellenized. And although it's perhaps not correct to call all the population that lived there at the time Greeks, there were many different nations and many different, at the beginning, client states of Empire of Alexander of Macedon and then of Rome and even Byzantium. The common language, or lingua franca, was Greek. People were gradually accepting Greek pantheon of gods, and even if, say, administrative language in later years would be Latin, nevertheless, the local population in between themselves were talking Greeks, and of course, with the ascent of Christianity, these old populations, they turned into Greeks from Asia Minor. And again, they may be by blood different people than, say, Greeks from Ellada. Nevertheless, culturally, they were very much alike. It was Hellenistic civilization. Again, according to Herodotus, in the time of ascent of Macedonian Empire, Greek influences, and then early Rome, Asia Minor was divided into different territories, and they roughly correspond to the division within the Roman Empire. So what most of these names you could encounter in the New Testament, especially when we're talking about the missionary work of Apostle Paul. And without delaying too much, we'll start to talking about it. Please forgive me for overbearing presentation with maps, and nothing but maps, but I thought it was very important to give you at least some brief idea about the territories that we're talking about. And these red dots, believe you or not, are the map not of all settlements in Asia Minor, but of Roman cities that existed in the second and third century AD, after Christ. So almost all of these red dots also correspond to Christian centers in their respective provinces. We don't think about it in that terms, but we have to realize that perhaps population of Asia Minor per square mile, kilometer, or whatever, was similar to the population of contemporary China. So it was a very densely populated land. It was indeed the center of civilization, populated by great number of people who came from all over the place with very, very ancient history, and who had in common particular cultural traits. In addition to their historical traits, of course, we have to say that a very important role that was played was this Hellenism, religiously speaking and culturally speaking. And almost every city, especially along the coast, had a very sizable Jewish communities. And here we see the four journeys of Apostle Paul, and look where the roots of those journeys are. All four of them inescapably deal with some of the cities in Asia Minor. Needless to say, then Tarsus, right over here, if you can see the cursor, is where Apostle Paul was actually born. Jew by blood and by confession, by creed, he was born in diaspora. And nobody would challenge his Judom, his Jewishhood, but nevertheless, he was in diaspora, like majority actually of the Jews at the time let them be converts from paganism, from Hellenists, or let them be Jews by blood. And it's a very interesting fresco of Apostle Paul found in a cave that associated with his ministry just on the outskirts of Ephesus. One very important place where that we need to mention, that is actually on the far corner of Asia Minor, was a technically Syrian territory, but in the 1920s and 30s where maps were redrawn after the conclusion of World War II and withdrawing French and British forces. This little appendicitis, if you wish, that goes into the Syrian territory is the city of Antioch. Antioch was one of the largest cities in antiquity, one of the most important cultural and literary centers of antiquity, and place of one of the largest Christian communities, albeit probably majority of them were from God-fearers or Hellenists who were preparing for conversion to Christianity, where the message was very well received. The home base of Apostle Paul on his missionary journeys, place from where he would depart and where he would return, the city of Antioch. Sadly, there is not much left of the city that produced great number of saints and Christian authors. John Chrysostom was native of Antioch, but this church, although you can see the front of it is dating to a medieval period of time, perhaps to the Crusader period, is considered to be the place where first Christian community was gathered, where they were coming together in prayer and studying of the scriptures, and where they for the first time were called Christians. Over here from Acts chapter 11, there is a description that relates to Antioch and how they were preaching and faithful were multiplying, and where for the first time the Jewish sect followers of Jesus of Nazareth for the first time was called Christians. Here's this interior view, part of the natural cave that has been transferred into a place of prayer, and where liturgies on request are celebrated even until the present day. Christians are still present in the city of Antioch. There are several churches of different Eastern confessions, not only Orthodox that are known there as Greek Orthodox of Antiochian Patriarchate, but also Assyrians and Syriac Church, although there is just a fraction of what it was there before beginning of the 20th century, and certainly by far less than it was throughout the history. But nevertheless, there are functioning Christian churches in the cities, even in the city, even until the present day. However, you are not able to see the might of the city. Mainly, it's built up by the modern buildings, hotels, administrative buildings, living quarters of the people. But nevertheless, it's an important place of where Christianity, in a sense of church history, have started, second only to Jerusalem. Another important early Christian centers, perhaps known to you or that you've heard about, are on the opposite side of Asia Minor, right by the Aegean Sea, so-called cities of revelation. And those are 7 cities selected by John the theologian, I don't think randomly, but to us randomly. We don't know why he admonished those particular cities, why he have selected those particular cities, because not all of them are actually mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, but apparently there were Christian communities there. And at a time when other cities where Paul and other apostles have labored, they also had, as we know, Christian communities, but they are not mentioned for whatever reason. So, but perhaps John the theologian had his particular, something particular in mind as he was addressing those churches. I'm not going to read all the quotes from the book of Revelation. For us, it's much more interesting from the historical sense, because it points out that our ancestors and faith were inhabiting the city as early as the late 1st, early 2nd century AD. Revelation of St. John the Theologian could be treated as a historical document because it mentions certain things that points out that author definitely knew some historical reality. So of course, we treat it as a part of the Holy Scripture, but we approaching this for the sake of today's lecture, from slightly different angle. And for us, it's very important to point out as to presence of Christianity, to establish the presence of Christianity all throughout the Asia Minor and importance of it. And you may ask, what is there? Is there anything left? Some cities, of course, disappeared since, and there is very, very meager ruins, but others are still there, despite the fact that they are seemingly in ruined state. During one of the travels to Asia Minor, somebody said to me, oh, there are so many ruins. Oh, those are just ruins. But if we're thinking about it, and I didn't mean it in a critical way or cynical way or to belittle the person who said that, Christianity is a very historical and I dare say material religion. Resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ is a material event. It's not just theological event. It's not just life-giving event. It's a very material event. He came back to life in body. His resurrection is not merely spiritual reality or imaginary reality. And Christians were coming to his tomb even when his tomb was not there, but when the temple of Diana, pagan goddess, was built on top of his tomb. They were coming to a place to witness even the area where that great miracle had happened, because it has personal relation to their lives, because it was motivation of their life, motivation of their existence. And when we're visiting the ruins, we're visiting very same stones amidst which our ancestors of faith have walked. For us, it's important not only as a cute, curious, very different historical remains. For us, it's very important as a witness to history that we adhere to and part of what legacy we claim to be. Very often we somehow gloss it over. And I have to say that talking to Europeans, people who live in Europe, who are surrounded by millennia of history, there is a totally different appreciation and understanding of what the historical stones are. On many occasions, people in the middle say, well, why are they fighting? Why they can move somewhere else? Why it's so important? But how it could not be important if your fathers and grandfathers lived there? They looked at the same area, they looked at the same hills, they looked at everything. You know, the Holy Land itself is called the fifth gospel. So by extrapolation, by application, the land on which saints have walked have the same value for us. And we, as Christians, from the very beginning, adore that historical legacy. And here I selected just a couple of pictures to show this striking difference. This building in front of you is a library of Celsus. It's in the city of Ephesus, one of the most important cities in Asia Minor, if not the most important, maybe second only to Antioch. A huge city, a very conveniently located, a port city, big administrative center, home to a huge temple of Diana, big pilgrim destination for pagans. And here somebody named Celsus lived, who was a Roman official and who was vehemently anti-Christian. And like many of our contemporaries who claim that reason defiles and defeats the faith, he was a learned man, and because of his investment, this beautiful building, you can see on the right-hand side of the library, it's the Library of Celsus, was built with multiple books for education and learning. And because he was a learned man, he thought that this knowledge of pagan books would defeat Christianity. And on the left-hand side, you can see very interesting graffitos. All of those graffitos are found in Ephesus. And you can see the earliest inscription, Iphis. You can see the circle that looks like a will. Over here, you can see, of course, the Christogram, you know, Alpha and Omega, the earliest Christian iconography in existence. Iphis, as you know, it's an abbreviation in Greek. It says fish, actually. But it's an acronym, and it says Jesus Christ, God, the Savior, the Son of God, the Savior, right? So, and this will-like things were an indicators for the Christians that there are Christian community in the city. It's from the very early point on, you know, Christians who are coming into the cities, they could look for their own. Our understanding of a period of persecution is really marked by absence of much of information. But Christians, even during the time of persecution, were allowed to build their churches, to have their councils, to come for open gathering, with interruptions, of course. We're thinking that the period of persecution was time when people were hiding in catacombs. Now we know it's not necessarily 100% correct. The reality was a little bit more complex, but certainly Christianity was not as much on a public display as it would be in the subsequent ages. Nevertheless, people, visitors who would come to the city would see the sign as an encouragement. We don't know how to read them perfectly, or whether those were signs where at a particular time of the day Christians would gather. It was like their secret gathering place. We would never know that. But nevertheless, this is a witness to the earliest Christian presence in this mighty city of Ephesus. The city was lavishly adored. It has so-called terrace houses where you could see very clearly of how Romans during the time of preaching of Apostle Paul have lived. This is a street that lead to the library of Celsus. You can see even the side streets, the pedestrian walks were paved with mosaics. It's right in front of this very lavishly decorated step houses where elite of the city have lived. All right. So it gives you a very good glimpse into how civilization over time was. You sort of walk a little bit in the shoes of the apostles, but nevertheless, we're here not for antiquities only, but also for very important Christian legacy. This next slides actually depicting the place where the word Theotokos, or the Mother of God, was affirmed and accepted by the entirety of the Eastern Church, less, Nestorius and his adherers. It's even before our very unfortunate division with what we called Monophysitic Churches, which there is a whole big issue on its own. I'm not going to go into theological debate, and there are many different takes on it, so I'm leaving all the debates outside the scope. But here, where we still were one East Church of the East, not one, many churches, but all unified by the very, very, very same creed before any major controversies. Well, less Arians again, but for simplified reason. Third ecumenical council that was held in Ephesus in 431 was held in this very church. Over here you can see the reconstruction model of the church. So we're looking at the altar and altar beams, altar area. It doesn't look like much, but just imagine. We mentioning the word Theotokos, we have particular adoration and name for the Mother of God. It was discussed and professed in this very place. Okay, so there are how many places historically that we could say and come and we could say it happened here? Well, this is one of the places. It may not look like much, but it certainly has this tremendous weight, tremendous impact if we'll reflect on the history of our theology, of our creed, of who we are as Christians, where the source of our confession is divine inspiration, yes, but physically those were people who walked in this very same building, pray in this very building when discussing very important measures. Next, a place that made Ephesus one of the most important pilgrim destination in Asia Minor is a very interesting and a little bit eerie legend of 7 sleepers of Ephesus. The story goes that during the persecution of Christians, 7 youth secluded themselves in the cave, and they slept for some 180 years later, when they appeared right around actually the time of the Council of Ephesus, a few years before that, and they walked and demonstrated themselves to the citizens of the city. Well, they didn't know. They thought that they were slept just for a short period of time, but it proven to be an absolutely overwhelming event, and then they were put back in this very same cave and buried there. Story is very hard to explain. The only one thing we can say that it in all of the early sources, it is testified as a true event. No matter how unbelievable it sounds to us, the modern people, it's absolutely central place where people would come and they would pray and they would venerate and ask for intercession of those 7 sleepers. Russian pilgrim Abbot Daniel in the 11th century, who traveled to Asia Minor, traveling to the Holy Land, he had testified that their relics were still there. Where they now, we do not know, but story was so important in antiquity, it entered even in Quran. It's the only Christian story from Christian hagiography that entered in the Quran. So in time when we don't know it, it's also a very major holy place. Again, it's lacks its former beauty, but nevertheless, that's the place. You know, for people think that there is very little left of Christian legacy, it's nevertheless there. And next slide represents the chiefest place of all of Ephesus, where people would come and pray. That is the tomb of St. John the Theologian. Over here, you could see the picture taken from the altar area looking west. Over here, you could see a tremendous basilica, domed basilica that was built over the tomb of St. John the Theologian. It's considered to be, from among those that have been discovered, one of the largest basilicas in Asia Minor. And I dare to suggest that it was built with an intent to outshine the glory of the temple of Diana. If you remember the Acts of the Apostles, there is the rebellion of Demetrius, the silversmith, because Paul with companions were preaching in Ephesus, and the silversmiths were losing their profits because pilgrims and citizens were buying less of their statuettes of the goddess that could be presented to her temple as a votive offering. But nevertheless, here John the Theologian, and tradition that intimately links him to Ephesus is very, very ancient, naturally, right, is celebrated. Continue on. It's very important to mention the town or city, ancient city of Laodicea. It located some 100 miles, or give or take, east of Ephesus, deep inland in a phenomenally beautiful location. There is actually a tri-city area, Hierapolis, about which we're going to talk in just a couple of minutes, Laodicea, and also there was Colossae. And Colossae is also arena of where Apostle Paul preached. One letter to Colossians is written. There was a miracle of Archangel Michael that is associated with the city Colossae, and where pilgrims were coming. Those have not been rediscovered, but nevertheless here, city of Laodicea. And what we see that is very, very interesting and very intricate is the illustration or an icon of supersession. It's one thing replaces the other. Over here on the left-hand side in a column, you can see the etching, the graffiti of menorah and the cross growing out of it. Somebody explained, oh, no, it's just Christian suppression of the synagogue. When Christians wanted to suppress something, they would put cross right on top of the image that was there before. Many Christians, don't forget, they were not only Jews by blood, but they may have been converts that were preparing themselves to convert to Judaism. And they understood themselves as someone who intimately linked to the synagogue. And they see the procession of that cross exactly out of menorah. Church as a continuation of the synagogue, the church as new Israel. And we hear about images like that, or it's compared in literary sources, but here we can see the column where it's actually very, so to say, iconographically presented. It's very hard to tell from which period of time it dates, but it's from the early, very, very early era as to when the Christianity was just taking root in this area. The next place you don't know about, perhaps, you could say, well, it's a basilica. Yes, it is a basilica, but what kind of a basilica? And I bet all of you benefit from what happened under the roof of this basilica. During the Council of Laodicea that was convened in 360s, 363, 364, local bishops gathered and drew the first canon about the canon of Holy Scripture that reaffirm previous debates in Northern Africa, and soon thereafter it would be affirmed in the writings of Cyril of Jerusalem. So the earliest references to our biblical canon came from actually this place. So it was in this basilica, and here the excavations of it and very tasteful rendition, an attempt to preserve it, but at the same time to give an understanding a little bit of how it may have looked like at the time. right, without violating the integrity of the archaeological finds, the baptismal font and the place where the bishops gathered. You can see here even the amvo from which the Holy Scripture was read. You can see still the beamers from the iconostas and presbyterium and everything else. It's artistic rendition of how the basilica may have looked like back in the day when the canon of Holy Scriptures have been discussed. And it's also, I believe, the very important place for all the Christians to gather and to pray, to praise our ancestors, because those are some foundational things for us as Christians. You know, when people would go to holy places in antiquity, most of the places, there was two categories. Most of the places were places of miracles, usually relics of the martyrs or holy fathers that were known to produce these miracles, predominantly miracles of healing. Okay, medicine was very poor. The only hope was naturally in God, and people and faith were bringing their ailments to the saints of God, and God through those saints was glorified again and again by providing multiplicity of miracles. But if we look at the origin of Christian pilgrimage, like say where Empress Helena went to the Holy Land in early 320s, those were visiting the places of importance, of where actual things related to the life of Christ had happened. We tend either to dismiss miracles wholesale or to believe in them so much as if dismissing completely the historical canvas of what was actually happening. But this is a commemoration of very roots. It's like coming, if you wish, to the Father's house. That's a true pilgrimage to the origin of where you are. You know, people in the Southwest go to Alamo, right? Or visiting, you know, Abraham Lincoln's, you know, cabin, or visiting, you know, the fort near Baltimore, right, where there was resistance to the English incoming forces. Those are places of civic pilgrimage. Those related to very particular historical places that are very important to our identity and to who we are and to whom we understand ourselves. So from the standpoint of Christian pilgrimage, I think it's also very important to visit those places that may not be necessarily associated with something particularly miraculous, but nevertheless still in existence and could give inspiration and perhaps would serve as an invitation to our more intimate relation to our own past. Right by the site of Laodicea, by the city of Laodicea, just on the other hill, over the Lycus Valley, we find a very beautiful travertines that are in modern Turkish known as Pamukkale, but actually is a site of ancient city of Hierapolis. City of Hierapolis was known as Delphi in Greece for its own oracle, because over here there was entrance to hell. And Strabo even describes as to how he purchased some doves and threw them into this area, and they inhaled this poisonous fumes that were coming from Hades, and they died. Curiously enough, when they discovered that site some years later, even the pictures were circulating in the media of the dead birds, because whatever geological activity is happening underneath, it still does happen. It has its own cult, and pilgrims were coming there from all over the place in pagan times. And even when Christianity have ascended and the cult was outlawed and the entrance into this temple and temple complex was walled in, still pilgrims were coming, pagan pilgrims, even as late as the 6th century, to offer their votive offerings and seeking some kind of guidance. To us, of course, this may be a historical curiosity, but what's very important to us is that place is associated with an apostle Philip. Not too many historical pilgrim renditions exist that indicate the veneration of this place, but putting two together, we could say it was one of the most important shrines in all of Asia Minor. St. Philip was crucified high above the city, next to the city cemetery, and during the time likely of Justinian, a huge basilica with big pilgrim complex, and even the only one, Beth complex, that was built specifically for pilgrims was erected on the place of his martyrdom. And here you can see the remains of this basilica, the icon from Mount Sinai of Apostle Philip. And here's how the rendition looks. There was a big triumphant processional gate that would lead to this basilica, and it was a feature that some of the basilicas would build in such shape. Of course, closest comparison that probably comes to mind is the Dome of the Rock. Whenever you see the reports from Jerusalem, you see this tremendous mosque, right? Built actually by the Byzantine craftsmen, but nevertheless, the prototype for it was likely in the ancient Christian arrangements, in ancient Christian places of worship. And I'm not trying to say that this was inspiration for Dome of the Rock, but nevertheless, just to give you the magnitude of what it was like. And of course, it's place of his martyrdom. In jumping a little bit back and forth, here we come to the Basilica of St. Nicholas, the wonder work of Myra and Lycia, saint from the 4th century. This current basilica dates from much later period of time, but it's confirmed archaeologically that it's built on a spot where the earlier cathedrals of Myra and Lycia was. Actually, Lycians are a very important nation in antiquity. On the Lycian Declaration, actually part of our United States Constitution is based. The semi-capital of Lycian Confederation was city of Patara, where actually many Orthodox saints came, like Methodius of Patara, and where St. Nicholas was actually born. But he came to replace his uncle in the service, and people were coming to venerate his tomb up until 1087, where his relics were stolen and transferred to city of Bari in Apulia in southern Italy. This medieval basilica still bear a lot of frescoes, and it bears the reported tomb or sarcophagi into which sarcophagus, into which the body of St. Nicholas was placed. So even his relics are not there. People are still venerate this place as a place associated with St. Nicholas. Those of you who've been to Dumbarton Oaks perhaps will see some familiar friends, but those are not friends, those are their brothers and sisters. The so-called Zion treasure, that is very important Christian treasure discovered in Asia Minor, one of the few intact treasures from the Byzantine period with ecclesiastical liturgical artifacts found anywhere. Part of it is still in Turkey in the Archaeological Museum of Antalya. Actually, it's a place known to Europeans as all-inclusive resort. Many people disregard its classical antiquity, which is tremendous, let alone the Christian antiquity. But over here, you can see some very valuable artifacts from the Christian periods, such as the censer or Eucharistic plates, or this handles for lamps. You know, the chains would be put through the openings and they would be suspended in the air, holding the oil lamps as they would be lit in the church. But of course, very, as I said, extraordinary classical legacy in the form of various sculptures, sarcophagi. And this, to me, in the lower left corner, to me, actually is very dear. In what sense? These are the pagan altars where probably in home environment people would ascend their prayers, where they would lit incense in many ways, just like we do during the prayer, and where they would pray to their pagan gods. Why I'm saying that it's dear to me, it's dear in association with the memory of the martyrs. Memory of the martyrs who culturally were these very people and who had completely rejected their past in order to embrace their new true faith. These are the ultimate witness to what they had to go, because really the challenge, the presentation was put a little bit of incense, pour a little bit of wine. Why it's so big deal? That's how your granddad and grandma and parents, who do you think you are? And just because they choose to adhere to their new faith and because they were not willing to compromise, they were martyred. So these little things, in a sense, and icons of Christian martyrdom as well, because it's from these altars that they had to depart in order to embrace the face of the crucified, dead, and risen Lord. Next picture is probably to demonstrate a little bit the beauty of the landscape in Asia Minor and the vastness of classical legacy, but not only, and I'm going to talk in just a few seconds about it. You know, classical theater, the downtown area with lavish fountain over here. There is artistic rendition of how it have looked like. So it's probably standing somewhere where these trees are, looking to this pile of rubble. And over here, magnificently preserved stadium. Imagine this stadium is nearly 2,000 years old. You know, you're coming and you're given goosebumps, because if not here, in many places like that, it's the place of the martyrdom of early Christians. They are brought to arena. What's arena? Arena is a sand that absorbs the sweat, the excrements of animals, competings and gladiatorial fights, and where Christians would kill, because sand also absorbs blood. So killing of Christians, killing of criminals and Christians among them was the sport, if you think about it. So whenever we're looking at ancient sports, it's not only very fascinating and to see, well, they look just like us, they're not very different from us, precisely, but our ancestors of faith were not very different from us of today, and also very often faced with these choices that they had to make on pretty much daily basis. Nevertheless, I'm thinking this one of my favorite sites there, and I could not skip it, but had to give you a little bit of introduction to it. It's also an aphrodisiac, and also a very interesting point of Christian conversion of pagan legacy into the new Christian reality. Needless to say, that name of city Aphrodisiac come from the cult of Aphrodite, ancient Greek goddess of love, and she had her special cult, and what would say miracle working icon, a miracle working statue, special statue of Aphrodite or Aphrodisiac. And it was in this very temple that in later time was converted to Christianity. And actually, in later years, in Byzantine period, the city would be known as the city of Stavropolis, or the city of the cross. Such was tremendous conversion of it, that perhaps a cross was venerated with miracle properties, or part of the true cross, we would never know that, but a place of firm adherence and prayer for the Christian folk. So that's how the city was very defined pagan worship center, was converted into Christianity. And there is no better picture, but you could see here the altar. I had to find this graphic scripture, not only Christian graffiti, we'll see it's superimposed. Remember, I was talking about menorah, where cross growing out of menorah. Over here, it's superimposed on the previous pagan inscription within this temple. But over here, you can see how the church was built. It was a sanctuary and the presbyterium and place where the altar was under the canopy and such. And it's right in this area in the middle. So it's also, when we hear the Christians building their holy sites and temples within the confines, within the perimeters of the pagan holy sites, over here you can see again a lesson in church history in very graphic form, where you could see it for yourself. And one of the most attractive regions in Cappadocia, one of them of Asia Minor, is Cappadocia. I'm sure that all of you, if not all, then most, have seen this very interesting chimneys. That's a geological occurrence. It's actually tufa. It's volcanic ash that was compressed over the centuries, and where it gave way, it eroded under the elements. And that territory was inhabited even from the time of Hittites. Remember the green map at the beginning? So, but it came to play a very important role during the early Christian period. Supposition made that Christian from nearby Caesarea would escape and hide in between this rather desolate, very strikingly beautiful but desolated region. It's fairly large. It's not like just some small valley that is pictured from all over the place. No, it's a very vast geographical area where actually Christians lived up until the exchange of population in early 1920s. So there were functioning churches and communities and schools of the Greek population, but then were removed. as part of the settlement between the Greek Republic and the Ataturk Turkey. So, but nevertheless, this land was inhabited by very heavily, very densely by Christians, and it's one of the centers of Christian monasticism, along with centers in Egypt and in Syria. So there is very little evidence as to how to link Egyptian Christianity to Cappadocian Christianity, but it's not improbable that monasticism at this time develops in several regions simultaneously. And St. Basil the Great, who would live in the 4th century, was already writing, and was Bishop of Caesarea, was already writing instructions to how monks have to conduct themselves, because those were just hermits, a little community of virgins living in complete desolation and austerity. There is no monasticism as we would know it in later centuries. This is very, very beginning. In fact, for Westerners, it's very interesting to know perhaps that Benedict rule for monasticism, the golden rule of monastic conduct in the West, was greatly inspired by the rule of St. Basil, the first known particular set of rules for the monastics. All right. So there are many curious things there. Besides geography, there is great number of underground cities. Some of them goes down as much as 10 stories. And during the time of enemy incursions, people would hide in those very intricately carved in the stufa rock cities that would go down many, many layers. And estimates are that in some of those cities, up to 20,000 people could hide at one time. Not only hide, but actually live for some extended period of time, for maybe months on. They had storage places, they had places for cattle. They, in Christian era, naturally, that's where most cities are coming from. They had churches, and there was a very particular system of ventilation, so they can live a very troglodyte lifestyle, this underground lifestyle, for an extended period of time. And just give you one example of this major outcrop, and it's all dotted with those holes. Of course, these big openings were not there to begin with. You know, the caves, natural man-made caves, were carved. But as I said, tufa is very soft and it gives way to the elements, and the external layers, they fall out, giving the view of the cave interior. So they would not look like Swiss cheese. Of course, they would have little holes, little entrances into them. But where the Christians were gathering, there were Christian cities, Christian villages, and many of those places were inhabited, as I said, even all the way through the 20th century. This is one of the monasteries, and that's exactly how it looked like. And as you come in, you can see tremendous halls, multi-story, very beautifully carved, and all of them inescapably were decorated with frescoes. Many of the churches served also as burial grounds, where monks and abbots of the monasteries were buried immediately underneath the floor of the gathering halls of the churches. But nevertheless, it's still just absolutely astonishing to see this beauty. Like, for instance, on the right-hand side picture, please forgive me, it's not the best of quality, and frescoes are greatly distorted by the soot from the fires that were burned inside, and they have not been restored. But look at these columns, it's all carved. It's all carved. Nothing has been built. It's all carved out of tufa. It's all as if you wish to say, one piece deal. And when you're coming in many of the churches, pretty much all of them have been decorated with beautiful frescoes. Some of very high artistic quality, some perhaps a bit simple in more provincial way, but nevertheless you could see very familiar themes, not only the saints, but complex imagery, right? For instance, this scene of Eucharist in the Church of St. John, or for instance, this perhaps was Egyptian influences church in the Hlara Valley. It was very interesting and very unusual for Asia Minor iconography, with very bright colors and very particular shapes of figures that give many researchers think about the Egyptian actual influence, and by that time probably there was quote unquote monastic exchange, and maybe some iconographers came from there. Again, another church, so-called Church of Centennial, with the depiction of the Ascension of Christ. Frescoes are done in layers, and the latest layer where you could see the depiction of the eyes or some small minute details, they flake away, but nevertheless you could see, just look at this fantastic designs. You know, people definitely were full of life. Not only they wanted to depict their beloved theological themes, appropriate liturgical themes, but they also wanted to make it bright and festive and very attractive. I jumped over, excuse me, we're back to this quote unquote Egyptian church. It's not Egyptian church, called Church of the Snakes because of the depiction of the dragon that's in Georgius and Theodore de Fit. But nevertheless, just to give you an example of this iconography, and perhaps the most beautiful church in all of Cappadocia, so-called dark church, it's astonishingly well preserved, and perhaps the iconographers from Constantinople or from other large iconographical center came and did the work inside of this church. And if you'll see it entire, it's not big, but it's sizable, and all of the surfaces are covered with these beautiful frescoes. And just think about it, it's not a built-up church, it's carved, but to model inside of this tufa rock, to imitate the construction as of the cross cruciform and cross dome church would look like if it was built from the ashlars and from the stones. But you can say, okay, that's wonderful. I mean, that's all very curious and nice, but how does it relate to us? Well, of course, by the legacy of Cappadocian fathers. The three great Cappadocians: Basil the Great, Bishop of Caesarea in Cappadocia; Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, who would become the Patriarch of Constantinople. Here they depicted on a fresco, right? Those were formative theologians for our Christian theology. They were foundational fathers. Their works are absolutely inescapable to any student of Christian theology. But besides them, there were a great number of saints. Remember that map at the beginning, how many cities there were? So almost all of those communities, perhaps all, but that we know, even that we know that was not lost, produced number of saints. And if we'll take into consideration that mainly martyrs and monastics were celebrated as monks, just think about how many men and women of faith there were. Over here, just a brief list, just a very, very brief list of the saints that region of Cappadocia, and more precisely the region of Caesarea in Cappadocia, have produced. You see, there are 20 names, and among them some very well-known saints in the Orthodox East, like Martyr Orestes is the physician, Martyr Blaise of Caesarea, of Laci, great Martyr Mercurius, the warrior saint in Caesarea, Saint John the Cappadocian Patriarch of Constantinople, and over here on the lower level, Saint John the Russian, a military soldier, probably from territory of modern-day Ukraine. But back then, of course, it was all Russian Empire, who during the war of 18th century of Russia against Turkey was captured and was sold into slavery. He's one of the chief patrons of modern-day Elad, of modern-day Greece. His relics are on the island of Evbeia, but he lived and died and struggled, lived very saintly life as a slave to a Muslim household in Cappadocia. And he had a great veneration, great cult upon his death. And of course, poor Greek population, what was removed from there and had to escape to Greece or move to Greece, they took the relics of St. John the Russian there, but he's also associated with Cappadocia. And St. Arsenius, the priest, monk, the baptizer, and the spiritual father of St. Paisius the Athonite, he was also from Cappadocia, if we're talking in terms of the 20th century, happened just before the exchange of population. So Cappadocia has tremendous, not only historical legacy to us, not only aesthetical legacy to us, but it also has a very profound theological and martyric legacy to us as a church that understood itself as mindful of the historical precepts. Moving to city of Istanbul, I'm not going to talk much about tremendous monuments that are known to all. And Istanbul perhaps is the only place that comes to mind when people visit Turkey and bypass. You know, so many people going to the Holy Land and they stop in Constantinople either on the way to Holy Land or on the way back. But I'm thinking during my short presentation, I indicated that it's perhaps a bit of an injustice to Christian legacy. Of course, Constantinople comes without parallel. I even debated whether to talk about it or not, for the simple reason that is, despite of its sad history, is very well known and the focal point of everything. But nevertheless, even despite the fact that recently Hagia Sophia was reconverted into the mosque, regardless of that, it still remains an important place of Christendom. We still could enter, we still could say our secret prayer. Yeah, we are guests in our own house, but nevertheless, it's still there. And next to it is the Church of Agierini, of Holy Peace, the church that predates even Hagia Sophia. Luckily, it was not turned into a mosque, but it's also witness to ecumenical councils. It bears the iconoclastic cross inside, this very, very interesting element, very interesting and curious presbyterium there. Church of Our Savior in Hora was beautiful, beautiful mosaics. In fact, there are a number of churches. There are a number of churches in Istanbul that were turned mosques. Almost all of them have been turned mosques. But recently, believe you or not, even in those mosques, there is an acknowledgement of Christian tourism. And some of those mosques or parts of them have been restored, and wherever mosaics or frescoes are, they have been exposed during the restoration. I don't know what's going to happen in the next 5 years. For instance, this church Hora, Our Savior on the Field, was a museum. Under the recent government, it was turned into a mosque, and they installed fabric shields on the little electric mechanisms that cover frescoes during the time of Islamic prayers, but they're lowered down and you still could see all this beauty. But the trend of past, say, 15 years was to uncover that Byzantine legacy. It was plastered over. It would have been unthinkable 100 years ago, 50 years ago, to expose it in so many mosques, but there are 5 or 6 more quote-unquote mosque churches where actually visitors are allowed and you can see this beautiful Byzantium. It's a little bit sad, I have to admit, naturally, but nevertheless, it's still there. I wouldn't say whether it's glass half full or half empty. It depends of how you look like, but when you love someone, does your love faint? You know, true love never faints. True affection never faints. The fact that your loved one is dead doesn't mean that he is dead, because we're all alive in the face of God or in God, but our personal love, our personal affection does not fade away. I mean, our loved ones are alive and well as long as we remember them in our prayers and as long as we have this loving communication with them. So to me, in a certain way, there is a spiritual connection to all these things, thinking about people who come there and prayed, not to look at what is there now, but the intent. I mean, the fact that somebody put a mask on something doesn't devalue it, doesn't desecrate it. We're always coming back to our burned houses and rebuilding them, and especially where the place of where our ancestors of faith prayed and show their devotion that serves inspiration to us even until the present day. There is a modern church, it was Church of Laharna by the Laharna Palace, was completely destroyed, but in the 20th century it was rebuilt, and it's associated with the miracle of the protection of the Mother of God. It's not a very big holiday in the Greek-speaking churches, but in Slavic churches it's a very big celebration. Curiously enough, it's the feast that commemorates miraculous event of delivery of Constantinople from the siege of barbarians, who were actually from the modern-day Scandinavia, Vikings and Russians of whatever sort, Slavs from Ukraine and from northern Russia, and they were defeated, while Mother of God have appeared. There is a little bit more complexity about the account and how 2 different stories may have been merged together. We're not going to look at it, but church was very important, and it's still functioning church. And actually, there are a number of churches, perhaps 24 functioning churches in Istanbul. Greek population is minuscule. Of course, the Patriarch of Constantinople, His Holiness Bartholomew, he resides in the region of Fanar, and the district of Fanar. But the church, but there are different functioning churches, and pilgrims are allowed to come and pray. They're not under Turkish control in the jurisdiction of the Patriarch of Constantinople. And one of those places is this Church of Our Lady of Laharna. Historically, it was very important because many of the ultimate Christian treasures were stored in it, and actually Crusaders stole it from there. One of them is the Shroud of Turin, of what the burial cloth of Christ that would become known as Shroud of Turin was kept in the Church of Our Lady of Laharna. So here we do come and pray. Okay, the Archaeological Museum of Istanbul, Constantinople, has a set of tremendous treasures. Don't forget that archaeology, as we know it in modern sense, started in late 17 to mid 1800s and continue from that point on much more professional scale, but greatest discoveries were done around that period of time. And some of these treasures, absolutely precious, they have a separate biblical collection. For instance, the talent. Remember the parable about the talents? That good master left to his servants talents of gold. It was measure of weight, and this measure of weight in the form of a duck comes from the Middle East, coming perhaps from the territory of Mesopotamia, from Iraq. This is the talent. This tablet, also from Mesopotamia, that predates perhaps our book of the Proverbs, is very close parallel to the wisdom of Solomon and Proverbs of Solomon. This largest picture is actually part of the Temple of Jerusalem. This is inscription in Greek for warning foreigners and pagans not to enter into the court of the temple, otherwise their life is going to be in their hands. It says something like that, so nobody should cross in. If you remember problem this depicted in the book of Acts, where Peter and John were preaching and somebody accused them for bringing a pagan into the temple, and then they explained that they did not. Well, there was on the lintel, there was special inscription. Two of them have been found. One is in the Museum of Israel, another actually in Istanbul. So it links intimately us right to Jerusalem. And this beautiful sarcophagus, there are several of them standing in the courtyard of the museum. Those are imperial sarcophagi into which emperors were buried: Constantine and Justinian and Heraclius and Theodosius and Phocas and so many others. Which and when is which may be a subject to debate, but porphyry was the most important or the most precious of the stones. Actually, it was mined in Egypt and considered to be to the present day an extinct stone, as it was mined out completely, and it was only imperial dignity that would allow the burial chamber, the tomb, to be carved out of that porphyry. There are no relics inside, but just as the reminder of the Christian Empire. I'm not going to do too much of the museum collections. Actually, we have a very nice presentation we were done about a year ago. If you look on my YouTube channel, there is a good friend of mine, Mark Madrigal, a Christian residing in Istanbul, who did an outstanding presentation on the biblical antiquities of the Museum of Istanbul. And I encourage you to watch it because it's truly very inspirational and very, very educational. So that brings us to the very end of our presentation. I do thank you very, very much for your attention, for coming today. As I said, my presentation was caused by my conversation with some of my dear friends who really had a little bit of a hesitancy when we talked about the Christian legacy of Asia Minor, believing that there is not much for us as Christians there. But I think that I tried to not persuade you otherwise, but to witness to a little bit different narrative, And even you may say that, you know, what you showed us mainly in ruins. Well, yeah, but where there are not ruins. If you go to the Holy Land, if there is a built church, historically it means only three things. That, you know, somebody in my childhood when I was growing up in Riga we came to the Baltic Sea and says, could you see Sweden from here? I says, sure you can. It says, but you need, on 3 conditions, you need to have a very good eyesight, good weather, and a lot of imagination. All right, so then you certainly be able to see it. Well, I do not want to discount what we see and experience in Holy Land, but it was destroyed and built up so many times that you don't touch the very stone on when Jesus said. And when you look at the actual sites that with all likely probability go all the way back, all the way down there to the history, it's also ruins. I mean, you go to Ireland to see the monasteries, what's left from the 6th century? It was all built out of wood. I'm not trying to advocate not to go and see, more so, go and see while it's still there. Go and see while it's still there, you know. As we traveled, say, 10, 15 years ago, and you could walk to Hagia Sophia and spend there hours and go and see this beautiful mosaic of the Savior and the Mother of God, the Baptist. It's off limits now. You know, I complained that description was not done correctly. Now you couldn't even see it. I mean, maybe it would open, maybe not. Who knows what's next, you know? A friend of mine invited me to visit Syria, and I said, oh, come on, I haven't seen France, I haven't seen Italy, why would I go to Syria? Well, good luck going to Syria now, you know. So I'm thinking that whatever is left, it's very, very inspirational, because it probably helps us a little bit to identify with who we are and what our legacy is. So I do thank you very much. And now the question times. I'm going to turn the mic on by muting you all, but now you're able to turn your microphones on. Please try to do it one person at a time. But first, I'm going to read the questions that have been sent in chat. I thank you very much for coming. I'm very glad that you enjoyed it. Again, I gave you bits and snippets of what's there. I give you bits and snippets of all there. When I just started to do the presentation, I realized that I'm stalling. I had 20 maps, one after the other. Right, so please forgive me. I probably overboard you with maps at the beginning. I showed only 5, right, out of 20. But those of you who know me know that I couldn't shut up, and I just needed to select the best of the best, you know, the cream of the crop. And questions: how much does the current population of Turkey know about the Christian heritage? It's a very difficult question to answer. It depends. Up until very recently, and the trends are changing very rapidly, I'm not going to discussing politics, especially young people in Turkey were greatly secularized. In any major center, you probably find more young Turks interested in Buddhism than Islam. You know, I don't want to be killed after making that statement, but it was my experience. I'm very much agnostic and very, very much secular. And there are actually Christian communities that are growing. Sadly, they're not Orthodox, they're Protestant, but Protestant mission does take place there. And there are Turkish Christian communities that are naturally become aware of Christian legacy. As far as the government of Turkey, I'm thinking they realize that Christian tourism is one of the venues. So it's not only the beaches, not only the resorts, not only cruises, and not only cultural classical legacy, but also Christian tourism. But of course, it's dizzyingly related exclusively to the biblical period. There is very little that is done as far as Byzantine period. And there were some American, mainly Protestants, who would go and train actually Turkish guides to talk about early Christian period. And some of the presentations are fairly sound, and some of them plain good. But majority of tour guides, even if they're great archaeologists, they're very oblivious to Christian history. They know very, very little. As far as Byzantine history, it's still a brand new subject, but don't forget that there is this very particular cultural divide, that Orthodoxy associated with Greekdom and Greeks viewed as enemies. There is no open hostility necessarily, but I encountered story from my Protestant friends there that they would outgrow actually Protestant communities, and they would say, well, we want to be part of historical church. But Orthodoxy understood as Greek religion. And the question is, what would I do if there is war and if I'm drafted in the army? how I'm going to fight against my co-religionists. To you, this question may sound strange, but these are real dilemmas that people face. I'm not getting any assessment, or I'm not, how shall I say, value or state or assess. But overall awareness is minimal. But in some places it's growing, especially if groups of tourists, of pilgrims coming. And some people are quite friendly, and especially like in Cappadocia, they'll point you out to this cave and that cave, and you may give them $1 or $2 as appreciation, and you may say that's type of a business, but they come, and if they speak even a little bit of English, they listen. And at least there is no this open confrontational animosity where they say, well, you know, away with you. So on that level, I never encountered any type of hostility and friendliness or what have you. People were very cordial in what I say genuinely. So I'm not talking about the entirety of the population, let's put it this way, okay? But I'm talking about the people whom I have had pleasure to encounter. And those are usually, you know, not necessarily educated people, but very mindful people, very, very mindful people. So overall, knowledge is minimal, but gradually, especially in part, maybe 15 years, it certainly does come to play a role. Some churches have been restored, as I mentioned. Of course, as the museums. Many have been neglected, many have been destroyed, but at least those who present some interest to potential quote-unquote customers, they do come play a role. It's very complex, really. It's very complex relation. I don't want to gloss over the difficulties, but it's perhaps for visitors not quite as bad for those who reside there, and accessibility remains possible. I just mentioned the video on the Christian antiquities in the Constantinople Museum. Could you say the name again or give a link? Yes. I could not provide the link here, but on YouTube, if you search under my name, Ilya Gotlinsky, you'll find on YouTube my channel, or search on Facebook. I'll try to repost it, and somewhere at the beginning of the collection of videos, it's called the Biblical Antiquities in the Museum of Constantinople, and presentation is truly outstanding. I love maps, don't worry. Well, at least somebody loves maps, that's okay. Now I do have a couple people here who actually have traveled with me. I invited them not as pay guests, they paid to travel, but I have them here as my witnesses, as I'm not just, you know, making things up, but actually trying to give as far as possible fair and unbiased assessment. From Lynn, one of format, before this pilgrimage, I thought Asia Minor was boondocks of Christianity, but I learned it's not boondocks, but bedrock, you know, and in many ways, it certainly is. It's sad of how unfortunate history of the place was. Indeed so, but nevertheless, it's certainly what's left there is highly inspirational, and this is fantastic without any kind of exaggeration. I did not touch, for the shortness of time, we're talking already for an hour and a half or so, I did not touch about southwest corner of Turkey, where this ancient temple Göbekli Tepe is, because for the longest time this area was off limits. It was place of Kurdish insurgency. There was open military conflict going on. If you read a book by William Dalrymple, which is called From the Holy Mountain, it's a fantastic book. It deals actually a lot with this area. The opening chapters of it provides a lot of information. It gives you goosebumps at times, but now you could travel there, and there are still very small communities, but the existing communities of Assyrian Christians, functioning monasteries. One of the oldest monasteries, one of the oldest monasteries that is just as old as monastery of the Burning Bush or Monastery of Transfiguration St. Catherine's, as it's known to us on Sinai, and has still mosaic of donated flower, more of a flower decorations than any particular subject, but donated by Emperor Anastasius. So there are monasteries, there are stylites. Stylite was hotbeds for stylites. The whole stylite movement we know about since Simeon the Stylite. There were hundreds of them in that particular part of the world. It was the center of their activity, if you wish. It would spread all over Eastern and Western Europe even, and all throughout the Asia Minor. But over there was a stylite style almost in every monastery, and there are some still there in situ. As there is part of the church in St. Ephraim of Syria preached. You do the prostrations, O Lord and Master of my life. Who is Orthodox don't know that prayer. Well, there is still church, part of it still standing where he was the catechist. All right, and it's accessible. I mean, it's a bus ride away. There are many different churches. There is incredible history. Antioch is accessible and safe. There is Mount Nemrut, was common. I'm not going to pronounce the name of civilization. I'm bad with names, in particular toward nighttime. My tongue twists, or don't, for that matter. So Commagenian culture, right? You have this mosaics of Zeugma, probably the most beautiful mosaics from antiquity found to date. So there is comment. We don't have many books in the Bible addressed to people in Asia Minor because Paul, John, and Philip lived and taught there. Yes, and from another gentleman attended same pilgrimage with Lynn and totally agree with her about the Asia Minor being the bedrock. Yes, it's indeed so. It's all of our history, is Eastern Christians, is one way or the other linked to Asia Minor. We think about the Holy Land as important place, and of course it is. I mean, you have to be crazy to doubt it. But then we're jumping in, and it's not only to Constantinople that we jumped to the entire region, because there were many different developments and events that were happening there that have taken place, and it still could be traced and seen and experienced in whatever form. When I go there, I don't wear a cassock on average, which tells you volumes. But hey, if this is the only inconvenience, then I guess it's okay by me. So my questions, you can turn your mics on if you'd like to comment. Any chance to go to Nicaea? The place where the church council have taken place is under the waters of Iznik Lake. Parts of Asia Minor are abundant with water, but there are also dry areas, and agriculture is one of the strong components of Turkish economy. In that area that I showed you, Asia Minor, there are over 90 million people living now. So it's not a small country by any stretch of imagination. Population is larger than that of Germany. And they need to eat. So there were many dams built, and inevitably some of the areas have been flooded, and some of the historical important areas flooded. So there is Church of St. Sophia in Nicaea, and there is the gate that led on to the Constantinople, but it's not much. I mean, yes, it's very important, but there is minuscule things left, like some of the churches of Revelation, like Thyatira and Philadelphia. It's a city park, and then there are several stones inside the park, and that's all that left of the city. So you could go there, but really not much. Nicodemia, place of a huge Christian church during the Emperor Diocletian, where great persecution of Diocletian started. He was annoyed by seeing big, beautiful Christian church, Diocletian. Before he started the persecution, he shoveled as many people in as he possibly could and burned it. We say 20,000 martyrs of Nicodemia. We don't know if there were 20,000 martyrs, but definitely there were a lot. There are very few, very scarce remains. Tarsus, there is practically nothing left. So need to find a way, and distances are huge. Distances are huge. So it's not like even in Europe where you travel by hour, 2 hours, and you're next place. Like Hierapolis and Laodicea, a 20-minute ride in between two cities, and those were very large cities in antiquity and big archaeological sites now. But sometimes you have to drive maybe 3 hours, and you have to climb up the mountains, and then you have to go down. It's perfect highways. You cannot go faster than you can go. Plus, we're talking about sometimes hundreds of miles of distance. So it's a beautiful land, and but it's very, very vast. So when you visit there, unless you have 6, 8, 10 weeks, you really need to select what you visit, where do you go, and what you do.
Father, I have 2 questions. One of them is, how many times have you done this tour to Asia Minor?
5 times.
5 times.
5 times, yes. And I probably would have done more, but again, as I said, I promised not to give any sales speeches, so probably I'll stop recording